Yes, welcome into the camp. I'm Zach Heilprin. He is the Athletics' Jesse Temple. Plenty to get to today. It was busy, actually a really good day for Wisconsin, or a good week for Wisconsin on the recruiting front. Got a couple more four-star commits. We'll talk about that. Jesse had an opportunity to chat with Barry Alvarez about his feelings on Luke Fickell, and we'll touch on a few more things as we get closer and closer to Big Ten Media Days. Now just a little over 2 weeks away from being in Indianapolis with the rest of the Big Ten media and all 14 teams. Badgers going to be on Thursday, the 27th. We'll be doing a couple of shows down there. All right, Jesse, let's just jump right into it. When there's been a lot of hand wringing over recruiting, when we talked last week, last show, it was Emilio Agard committing, a four-star recruit. They picked up two more four stars. The first one, Emerson Mandell out of Minnesota, the number one player in the state. PJ, what happened? And obviously, then they get their running back, Darrion Dupree out of Illinois, both four-star commits. They now have 6 four-star commits according to the 24/7 composite. And which one do you want to start with? Do you want to start with Mandell? Just because
We
we'll
should
just go
because
chronologically.
yeah, I think that makes the most sense.
All right. So the big guy, the number one player in the state for Minnesota. It's the third time in the last 5 classes that Wisconsin's taken the number one composite player out of Minnesota, Caden Johnson in 2020, Riley Mahlman in 2021, and now they get Emerson Mandell. And a lot of people have been just talking about how it's a bit of a flip, right? It's just they're just flipping. They get Nathan Roy, Wisconsin gets Emerson Mandell, but he's a big guy. He's not a tackle. He's going to be an interior lineman for Wisconsin, which was a need, I think, certainly in this class. What's Wisconsin getting in him?
Well, when I talked to Luke Fickell a couple weeks ago for that story on recruiting, and Luke provided a lot of detail and context for what their philosophy was. Again, he couldn't speak about specific recruits because that's against NCAA rules. But even then, he was talking about how we've got 4 offensive linemen committed, and there are some others in the mix, and any more would be, quote, icing on the cake, end quote. That's what he said. Now, he may have had a pretty good inclination of where things were headed, but that's how I view this as well. Even without Emerson Mandell, you had 4 offensive linemen in this class, one of whom is a 4-star prospect in Kevin Haywood, a tackle from Pennsylvania. But to come in and get Mandell later on, I think speaks volumes about what Wisconsin is building and what they've been able to do. He's, as you said, being recruited as an interior player, most likely a guard. I think he's 6'5", 295. You never really know how accurate those heights and weights are at the high school level, and you really find out once they finally get to campus. But this is a huge recruiting win for Wisconsin, not only to be able to get a 4-star prospect, but as you said, the number one player in Minnesota, to really take them from the Gophers, which had been recruiting Mandell for a long, long time. This new staff has only been in Madison for 6-7 months. So it's a huge win. The offensive line class is now solidified for 2024. They've got 5 offensive linemen committed, including 2 4-star prospects. And it is interesting because lots of hand wringing about the in-state recruiting. And I know you feel very strongly about the fact that this may work in 1 year or in 2 years, but you're going to have to be able to keep the core guys in the state in the future. I certainly agree with that. But if we're only speaking about 2024, and you just because you don't have a Donovan Harbor, you didn't get a Garrett Sexton, I think if you were a Badgers fan and you just saw who you were getting, you would have to be pretty pleased with the quality of players that they've gotten, even if they're not from the state of Wisconsin.
Well, some people would say Minnesota is in-state recruiting. I think there have been some people that would suggest that. It was actually in my mentions, in-state recruiting, which did not please a lot of Minnesota people. Had a lot of Minnesota people getting after it in my mentions for someone saying that. And one of them was, Wisconsin, they took our third plus. We took their best player. They got our third best player. Cause like, if you look at, depending on which rankings you want to look at, and one Nathan Roy liked one of those tweets. So he's surfing around and diving into mentions, which is interesting, a little thin skinned, if you ask me. But whether it's a trade or not, it's irrelevant. Like, I think Nathan Roy is a guy Wisconsin absolutely desperately wanted. They didn't get him. Okay. He goes to Minnesota. Emerson Mandell was barely on anybody's recruiting radar. They didn't offer him until what? April, May. I mean, it was really late in this process that they actually offered him. Minnesota, when he was first offer, he visited Minnesota how many times? And for Wisconsin to go in there and pull him away, And I totally agree with Emerson Mandell. Why would you want to play for PJ Fleck when you could play for Luke Fickell? I mean, it's just common sense. It makes complete sense to me. But for them to go in there and get him so late, that's a huge win. Huge win.
Yeah, and again, filling up the interior, which they're always looking for. Wisconsin's going to, even though the system is changing and the scheme is changing, Phil Longo has talked about this, and so is Jack McNeil Jr., that they're going to go get the 6'7", 6'8" big boys. That's going to continue to be paramount. But if you can get some guys with a little more athleticism, versatility on the interior, someone like an Emerson Mandell, the 6'5", 6'4", 6'5", 6'6", I think is what you're generally probably looking at for someone on the interior at the Big Ten level, or at least at Wisconsin. I can't say enough how big of a win this is in recruiting for Wisconsin. And I think if you're just looking at the 5 offensive linemen that they're bringing in, they have to feel pretty good about what the future holds at that position group.
So it was Emerson Mandell in the middle of the week, and then comes news that Darrion Dupree finally, a lot of people have been waiting for Darrion Dupree to make a decision. The running back out of Illinois, he is a 4-star commit. He's the second highest rated running back they've gotten since Corey Clement. The only one higher rated, at least in composite rankings, was Jalen Berger. And again, talent was never a problem for Jalen Berger at Wisconsin. He was a very talented kid. Just a change of scenery was necessary, I guess, for Jalen Berger. Seems to have found some footing at Michigan State. But getting Darrion Dupree, obviously significant for the Badgers. He's the second running back in the class. And watching his film, he jumps out, man. So he visited Wisconsin on the 2nd. Everyone expected him to commit. He didn't. Took his other official visits, including to Illinois and to Missouri. And then he ends up finally choosing Wisconsin.
This to me is maybe the biggest, or certainly one of the biggest commitments that Wisconsin has in its 2024 class. I might go with Mabry Matire at the top, simply because after they got rid of Austin Alexander, or they parted ways, and he's obviously now committed to Kansas. Mabry became the first committed prospect in the 2024 class, and certainly the first kid in this new coaching staff class, and he's been able to help build the group. It helps to start with a 4-star quarterback. But beyond that, Dupree, he's the guy. He is the dude, and he was at the top of this staff's recruiting board at running back all along. He came up in January. They offered him in late December, so he was obviously on their radar in that first month. Came up for a junior day in January, came up again in April to see a spring practice, and then the first weekend of official visits in June. So to get a kid of this caliber at that position in particular, I think will help Badgers fans breathe a little bit of a sigh of relief, because the two position groups that fans have been kind of clutching their pearls about at this point, just because it hasn't been filled up in the way that they hoped, defensive line and running back. And we're still waiting on defensive line. But we know how important running back has been. They had Gideon Atuka, the 3-star running back from Maryland. Dupree, he is a 4-star running back, but if you look at the film, like you were talking about, Zach, he's got explosiveness, power, speed. He's got everything that you would want. And I had a chance to talk to Darrion for the story about his commitment, and he feels really good about Wisconsin, because in this new offense, a lot of similarities to what they did or what they're doing at his high school in Chicago. Shotgun spread. He can, he doesn't need a lot of creases, but if you look at one of the first highlights on his film, there was a game against Marist, which is the school that Jamel Howard played for, the 2023 signee. He breaks 3 tackles. It's sort of like a jaw-dropping run. It ends up being a 55-yard touchdown run. He breaks a dude at the line of scrimmage. He gets past a second and then a third, and then outruns the entire defense. And I think that it's that explosiveness that really excites Wisconsin. So as huge a recruiting win as Wisconsin could have, and I think there was a little worry, not necessarily on the Badgers staff's part, but on fans' part about where things stood, because he did want to see his official visits through. And when I talked to him, the biggest challenger was Michigan. And I thought it was interesting that Michigan got the first commit, Jordan Marshall, who had Wisconsin in his top 4. And then they got a second running back commitment the weekend that Darrion was going to go to Michigan. He ended up not taking that OV to Michigan, was considering Washington, but didn't go out there. So he just took the 3 to Wisconsin, Illinois, and Missouri. But this was the place for him. And what I think is even more fascinating right now is, as we're having this conversation, Wisconsin may not be done. There is certainly a third running back in play, or at least somebody who took an official visit in Dylan Jones, who's a 4-star prospect and has not made his decision public.
And this is something we've talked about. Are they going to take 2? Or are they going to take 3? Obviously, Gideon Atuka was the first commit. But when you look at Gideon Atuka's film and you look at Darrion Dupree's film, feels like a really good combination. Does it not to you? I mean, I don't want to say thunder and lightning because that'd be a little unfair to get into Tuca based on speed wise. I know people have called out of speed and you took issue with that. Not issue with that. You said he's a little bit faster than maybe people give him credit for. And then you look at Darrion Dupree and you talked about the run that he had. A lot of people look at him just like as a scat back and a guy that's just gonna, not be physical and not run through you. He's got that too. So I don't want to just say thunder and lightning, but I think they complement each other pretty well.
Yeah, absolutely. Body type, skill set. I think Ituka's 225 pounds right now, which is ridiculous for a high school junior, a guy who's going to be a senior next season. Yeah, I'm not saying he's a burner and he's going to beat Usain Bolt in the 100, but if you do look at some of the film, he does have some nice burst on him. And I think you look at that in relation to his size, but he's got the power, and it could be a really nice 1-2 combo. The one thing I would say is I asked Darrion, what does he have any concerns? Because there already is a running back. Maybe there's a third running back in play. And he said that he actually likes the idea of having a 1-2 combination. They can push each other. They can make each other better, and they can make the offense better. Again, don't know what's going to happen with the rest of this recruiting and some of the other guys that are still out there on the board. But right now, Wisconsin has certainly done its work on the recruiting front at running back. And Dupree is, again, one of the biggest pickups in this 2024 class and someone I know Badgers fans had been waiting on for a long, long time.
All right. So those two guys are in the boat. There are a couple in the boat.
How dare you, Zach? I thought you said
I was joking with you.
I
was joking with you. It's a ridiculous saying. And the Minnesota fans have said it all the time. Oh, this guy's in the boat. Shut up. No, stop it. So yes, Wisconsin, those two guys in the class and now sitting at 17 players. Last I looked, I haven't looked this morning. It was still in the top 25. I think it was 21 when he committed. So it's a good class. There are still a number of guys out there. You mentioned the defensive line. Who are some of the, and obviously the edge as well. So who are those? There are a couple guys still out there going to be making decisions soon.
Yeah, so the one, if I'm a Badgers fan and I'm looking for who could be next, I think Inelu Lafale has got to be the one. He's announced that he's going to be committing on Tuesday, July 11th. That's been out there for quite some time. I know that Wisconsin has felt pretty good about where it stands for him. Really interesting prospect because even the previous staff, which was really interested in him, Bobby April viewed him as potentially the next Nick Herbig. Saw a lot of similarities. Now, obviously, they're both Hawaii kids. Lafele played at St. Louis school. He's at a different school now in Hawaii, but a lot of those traits. So I think Wisconsin is in a good position for him, but you still need some help at defensive line. And to me, that's a much bigger question mark at this point. A couple guys have come off the board recently. Liam Andrews is someone who's still out there, with top 100 guy, defensive lineman out of Massachusetts, but I don't think anything's imminent with him. So I think Lafele is the one that you should really be looking for at this point. And beyond that, it's kind of still up in the air.
The one name that we talked about earlier in the spring that kind of surprised everyone with his decision was Dylan Johnson. I don't know if do you remember Dylan Johnson? He's a defensive tackle out of Joliet, and he was a wrestler. So he had a wrestling background and obviously his football. Chose Northwestern. And I'm not going to dive into the whole situation that's happening at Northwestern because I think a lot of facts still out there. But it's been a rough few days for Pat Fitzgerald and that program right now. And if Pat Fitzgerald isn't there, then perhaps Dylan Johnson may be back in play for Wisconsin if that's something that they're still interested in. And thinking about the defensive line. And again, who knows what's going to happen at Northwestern? There's a lot of unknown. But Dylan Johnson, maybe come back around on that one and see if that's a potential guy that you could add.
Yeah, I think based on what we've seen in these first 7 months, we know that Fickell and his staff are going to be relentless in how they recruit players. They go after guys even if they're committed elsewhere. The Trech Kahuna example comes first and foremost in my mind, obviously, to get Jamel Howard back into the fold. And those are 2023 guys, but they know they need additional resources on the defensive line. If it doesn't happen in this recruiting class, that's why you've got the transfer portal. But there's 4 guys that are going to be seniors on this roster next season, and they need reinforcements. Everywhere else, every other position group, I think you would have to feel pretty good about where Wisconsin stands. And overall, it's worth noting, you mentioned they've got 6 4-star composite players in this class, and they're not done. But it just at this point, that's the second most, I believe, that they've had in the online recruiting rankings era, which is at least notable that the quality of prospects that they're going after and the ones that they're able to land, especially the ones who take official visits, it's been really impressive. The only one that had more was the 2021 class that ended up number 16 in the 24/7 Sports Composite. That's the only class Wisconsin's had that finished in the top 25. So this class, it still has an opportunity to be a top 25 class. It's really hard to tell at this point because some of those other programs are going to come up over the top of Wisconsin and get guys later in the cycle. But I think overall, they've done a very good job in 2024.
Who are those guys in 2021? Do you remember off the top of your head? Obviously, Logan Brown was one of them.
No, Logan Brown.
Excuse me. Nolan Rucci was one of them.
Yeah, Nolan Rucci was one of them. Man, I'd have to look it up, but like Braylon Allen, Hunter Wohler, it ended up being actually guys who I thought initially were 3-star, and when the cycle closed, they were 4-star composites. Like Marcus Allen ended up being a 4-star composite, if I'm not mistaken. I think they had 7 guys who are considered 4-star prospects, and then 1 5-star prospects, maybe even 8 4-star prospects. So we know that doesn't always translate into wins, but at least it gets people excited, and it's a baseline for how evaluators believe a player is coming out of high school.
Well, it was Nolan Rucci, it was JP Benshaw, it was Riley Mallman, TJ Bowlers, Hunter Wohler, Braylon Allen, Marcus Allen, Jake Retzloff, and Daryl Peterson.
Yeah.
That's a lot of 4-star guys. Is that Is this the I just want to make sure I'm looking at the right one here.
You are. I was surprised when I saw it too, because some of those guys weren't 4-stars initially, or they were 4 and 1, but not in the composite.
Like Jake Retzloff.
Yeah.
Like that kind of came out of nowhere. Either way, I don't know if that was composite or 24/7. Either way, it's irrelevant at this point. It's a good class, Wisconsin's class. It's a good one, and they're still adding to it, and we'll see what they can do here. As it is the dead period right now, right? I think it lasts for another week or two. So we shall see. All right, switching gears. You had an opportunity to chat with Barry Alvarez last week. Sat down, get his impressions of what he's seen from Luke Fickell so far. A ton of interesting things, within that article. But what stood out for you? What's the biggest point that stood out for you in that conversation?
Well, I think the thing that, and it's the quote that I used when I tweeted out the link, is him talking about the way that this staff is adjusting to the times. Barry said, you can't do what you did in the 90s or the 2000s. You've got to be able to adapt and evolve. And that's what this staff is doing. And I thought that was noteworthy just because they're obviously making some considerable changes, particularly when it comes to the offensive strategy. Barry built this empire, right? We saw what he was able to do in the 90s, and there are a lot of things that still hold true. But that to me was kind of the quote that stood out most. Obviously, he had a lot of complimentary things to say about Luke and this staff. I wouldn't expect him not to, based on what we've seen, and certainly Barry being a public figure and having a vested interest in Wisconsin. But that was the thing that stood out most to me, and other things too, just about the offense in general, because a lot of people think, well, this is just going to be such a drastic departure from what Wisconsin has done, and it is. But Barry said he's had a chance to talk to Phil Longo and likes the plan, that they're still going to run the ball. Phil had a lot of success running at North Carolina. It's just going to be in a little bit different way. And then Barry feels like that evolution is good for Wisconsin and good for college football.
Yeah, there was so much to it in that article. I think one thing that really stood out to me, and it has nothing to do with Luke Fickell, has nothing to do with recruiting. He hasn't talked to Jim Leonhard.
Yeah.
I mean, that is really surprising considering it was his guy. He played for Barry. He has been here since 2016. He's a legend at Wisconsin. And for him to have not talked to him since that decision was made, it's kind of eye-opening.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting. When Barry talks us, you're usually going to get good stuff. So Jim's just kind of disappeared here for this year, and I'm not surprised by it. We know, had some other opportunities. He's staying home with his family for a little bit, recovering from surgery. I expect him to pop onto the radar probably next year, but that was definitely interesting because I know Barry was conflicted about the whole situation and how it went down just because Jim was his guy. I mean, Jim is the story of Wisconsin football, really. Just you get an in-state walk-on. Nobody knew who the hell he was. He goes and runs a 4.4 at a summer camp to show Barry that he deserves to even be on the roster and then becomes a 3-time All-American. And I think a lot of people felt like Jim did enough to earn the opportunity. But 7 months down the line, you're also looking and saying, well, it was still the right hire to hire Luke Fickell. But yeah, that's what Barry had to say. They talked before all of this went down, but haven't since.
So the other, I thought one other aspect of this is, the excitement surrounding Wisconsin football. And the quote that stood out to me was, it's going to be a new brand of football, and that's good. That's healthy. This has been 30 years of Barry, right? I mean, it's not been him the entire time. It's been different coaches, but it's been him. It's been his stamp, right? Whether it was Brett Bielema, whether it was Gary Anderson, maybe not Gary Anderson, so maybe 28 years out of 30. Whether it was Paul Chryst, it was still Barry Alvarez. It was still Wisconsin football was Barry Alvarez. And I think more so than anything, this is the brand. While you're going to be playing on what you had before, you're going to be playing on what you were as a program for the last 30 years and that history, and you're playing up that history. This is the first true change, brand change that Wisconsin has made in these last 30 years, where Barry's kind of not on the outside by any stretch, but not necessarily right in the mix of it either. And so it's a change, and people are excited about that change. But this is truly. They've had coaching changes, but this is a brand change in my mind.
Absolutely. I mean, Barry's in a position where he's 76 now. He retired from being the AD in 2021. I was here for 31 years, something like that. And it's well past torch passing time. But now with the new staff, obviously Barry is the one who's responsible for hiring Paul Chryst. And so it was, even though he had stepped away, it was still the guy that he put in charge of the program. And now it's somebody that Chris McIntosh put in charge of the program. So these are not Barry's decisions anymore. But he does feel excited about what's possible. He still has his finger on the pulse of things. And even when I was talking to Luke about, I think I had asked him some question about in-state recruiting and whether he had talked to Barry at all or whether too much had changed because Barry hadn't actually coached for a full season in 18 years. And he said that something to the effect of, I'm planning on calling him and talking to him in the next week or something like that, just to pick his brain. So Barry is still tremendously important and a valuable resource, but this is not his program anymore. This is Luke's program and his staff. And Barry's certainly on board. One of the quotes that Barry said that I thought was interesting was in reference to the offense. He said, you don't have to just line up in there in 2 tight ends and blast people and play against 9 in the box all the time. They've got a good plan. He talked about how they look at what the defense is presenting and will decide whether to run it or throw it. And he just likes their philosophy and the plan. And so it is very interesting. It's an interesting time, kind of an inflection point in Wisconsin football in general, where this is no longer Barry's program, or even as an athletic director, it's somebody else's, and they're going to put their own stamp on it in a new way.
He has been the face of the program for the last 30 years.
Yeah.
Right. Like even when Brett Bielema was here and that personality, it was still Barry. He was he obviously was the head coach just before it and was still the AD. And when people think about Wisconsin football or people think about Wisconsin in general, in sports, athletics, he's the one that comes to mind. And for whether that's good or not, right? Like players come and go. Barry was the face of it. And across the country, if you were asked about Wisconsin football, it was, Barry Alvarez was the face. And now I think if you were to go across the country, a lot of it would be Luke Fickell because of that name, because of that personality, because of the big personality. I shouldn't say big personality, because of who he is and what he's done. That's what people are thinking about in my mind across the country now. I think that has changed. It has not been that way for 30 years. It's been Barry Alvarez, and now it's Luke Fickell.
Yeah. And another thing I didn't mention about this conversation I had with Barry is just the praise that he had for Luke. Obviously, he knew of Luke from afar, watched him from afar when Luke was a starter on the defensive line at Ohio State in those games when Barry was the coach on the other side. So he's known about Luke for a long time. Barry couldn't have been more impressed with what Luke was able to do at Cincinnati to take a program like that. Whereas Barry said, you're not going to get the top guys in the state of Ohio away from Ohio State. So you've got to do it in a little bit different way. You've got to develop them. And to take a team like Cincinnati and become the first and only group of 5 team to make the college football playoff said a lot to Barry. He likes just the personality that Luke has. He talked about how he likes the idea of a football coach who is a wrestler because they have that tenacity and that intensity. And he also just likes what has happened in these 7 or 8 months in general about what Luke has been able to do to put Wisconsin in this position to potentially be successful, and certainly to build up the level of excitement, because he said they went after the positions that they knew they needed to get. And he very specifically talked about getting the quarterbacks that they did, but also wide receiver. And so that's notable. It's generated excitement, and so has this new offense. So Luke has done everything at this point to build that excitement. And you're right. I think certainly as time goes on, people are going to associate more and more Wisconsin football with Luke Fickell.
All right, changing gears. One last thing here before we go. Actually, there are a couple more things, but I wanted to do this because this was also on The Athletic, and they just released, who is it? Who's your draft guy?
Is it Dane Brugler?
Yeah, Dane Brugler just released his first look at the quarterbacks for 2024.
Okay.
And obviously Caleb Williams, number 1, Drake May's up there. It was notable that he mentioned in talking about Drake May that that he's got a new offensive coordinator, right? So here's the quote from him. He said, the other major change for May in 2023 is that he'll have a new play caller after Phil Longo left Chapel Hill for the same position at Wisconsin. While Longo has a history of productive offenses, NFL scouts are eager to see May in a more refined and balanced scheme. That to me is a little interesting. Is it because they weren't able to run the ball? Like, what's he talking about balance there? I wonder. Is he talking about pass, run pass balance? Is he talking about formation balance? Like, I don't know what he's talking about balance wise there.
I'd be speculating just like you. My guess is that people look at the system that Longo is doing and think that it is something that succeeds in college, but maybe if you do it in that exact way in the NFL, it's different. I mean, it's hard for me to decipher. I almost feel like that's completely irrelevant in relation to Wisconsin, mostly because whatever Wisconsin's been trying to do for the last 3 years has been boring, predictable, and ineffective. And so who cares if it doesn't work somewhere else? If it can work at a place like North Carolina or Wisconsin, that's all that matters. But I mean, that is interesting. And obviously we'll have to see what happens with Drake May and the rest of his college career and his pro career. But either way, if you're a quarterback, this is, especially at the college level, this is the kind of offense you want to be a part of. And I don't know. It's hard for me to say because they are, to me, pretty damn balanced when you're just evaluating the run pass, yardage and ratios, and it can depend based on personnel. But I just think I think Wisconsin is in a really good position with what this offense can be for the Badgers.
All right. So another part of that article was listing the top senior quarterbacks. He listed the top 25. Tanner Mordecai was not on it.
Mm-hmm.
Some of these other names transferred, some of the other quarterbacks that ended up elsewhere and transferring, whether it's Sam Hartman or Brendan Armstrong or DJ, whatever his last name is, at Oregon State. I'm not going to pronounce it, but he's not on it. Is that surprising at all to you?
No. So I had a mailbag that ran last week in The Athletic, and somebody asked me a question about why are prognosticators not very high on Tanner Mordecai this season, because he's got a proven track record at SMU. But if you look at, and this is kind of that offseason fodder, and we're in July, so this is part of the conversation. If you look at who people rank as the top quarterbacks just in the Big Ten, you would see Mordecai 5th or 6th or 7th behind a lot of guys who really haven't done anything. And I had this in the mailbag, but the guys that you would generally see ahead of Mordecai, J.J. McCarthy at Michigan, Talia Tagovailoa at Maryland, Kyle McCord at Ohio State, Drew Aller at Penn State, and even in some of these rankings, Cade McNamara at Iowa. Well, McCord has thrown 58 career passes. He's got 1 start. Aller's thrown 60 passes. He was a true freshman last season. And you might even see other names up there, like other guys who have transferred into the Big Ten. Hudson Card at Purdue, Jeff Sims at Nebraska, Luke Altmaier at Illinois. the one of the interesting quotes that I saw was from Tom Fornelli at CBS Sports, and I'm quoting him here. He said, "If you were to ask me to rank the Big Ten incoming transfer quarterbacks, there's a good chance I'd rank Tanner Mordecai behind every one of them. That said, none will have the impact of Mordecai because of what his transfer represents." I think that's really strange. It almost feels slightly contradictory, but I almost wonder if it's just about the questions that people have about Tanner. Okay, he did this at SMU. Can you do it in the Big Ten? Is he going to take to this new offense? Does he have? I honestly don't know. It's surprising to me why he is not coming into the season considered a higher caliber quarterback. I think he's going to put up the numbers. I think he's going to deliver the ball where it needs to be. Some part of me wonders, did people just look at the one practice that was on TV and see that he was terrible and think that's who he is? I think you and I both know that's not. But there's a lot that goes into this conversation that to me is really fascinating, because I think he's going to have the best season by an individual at Wisconsin at quarterback since Russell Wilson. He's not going to have 33 touchdowns and 4 interceptions like Russell, I don't think, but I would expect him to be as good as certainly any quarterback Wisconsin's had in the last decade. That doesn't even feel like an unreasonable statement.
It doesn't. I mean, the season that Jack Cohn put together in 2019,
very good, very
impressive, right? So there's that, and then the other high touchdown seasons, whether it's Joel Stave in 2013 or Alex Hornibrook in 2017, also came along with a lot of interceptions. I think Joel had 13 and Alex had, I think, might have been 15. That to me is the biggest question with Tanner, is limiting the mistakes and limiting the turnovers. I mean, he did throw 20 some odd interceptions the last 2 years total. That said, he threw the ball a hell of a lot. So, I mean, 22 interceptions compared to Joel Stave's 13 interceptions, it's a little bit different. Not slighting Joel Stave whatsoever, like our guy Jim Polzin did in his recent story. No, I'm kidding. So he did this re-ranking. He did the re-ranking of these numbers of the best players to wear individual numbers. They did it in 2008. 15 years later, they did it again. And number 2 is obviously Jamar Fletcher, right? Like that hasn't changed. But he also did the best person to wear it in the last 15 years. And he put Jay Valai. Is Jay Valai the all-time winningest quarterback in Wisconsin history? No, he is not. I'm slightly joking. Jay Valai was fantastic. It was the hardest hitting guy at safety I think Wisconsin may have ever had. He just absolute missile anytime the ball was anywhere close. But Joel Stave, yes. So in terms of what Tanner Mordecai is going to give them this year, that is my only question, is can he limit the turnovers? And yes, we saw what happened in the spring. That was not him for most of the spring. So I'm excited to see what it looks like in fall camp. We're not too far away. Not too far away from fall camp. It gets going August 1st, going to be happening down in Platteville. Will Jordan Turner be reinstated by that point? I am not sure. Some more details coming out about that this week. He was going 117 miles per hour. He told in Rock County. He told police that he didn't want to be late for practice. He was trying not to be late for practice. Where does that stand on a list of excuses? Is it a bad one? Is it a good one? Is it a horrible one? I mean, I don't know. I have to imagine, I assume he was trying to get back for with Lyft or something like that. So I have to imagine Brady Collins is probably not okay with that excuse.
It's
a tough scene. It's a tough scene.
I don't know that I can rank the excuses, but it's a bad situation, obviously. I mean, I think I may have said this on the last show, but thank God, as far as we know, nobody else was injured. Like, it could have been a terrible situation in terms of catastrophic for other people on the road. Yeah. I don't know what's going to happen with if and when he's reinstated. This is obviously a severe situation. And as we're learning, there have been multiple issues, traffic citations, obviously the OWI. He's a great player. He's a starter for Wisconsin, but at the same time, Luke Fickell is coming in with a new staff, and you want to be able to set an example, and not just because you feel like you need to show people, but because something like this can't be tolerated. And now, what does that mean? it's not for me to decide, but this is clearly a very serious offense and something that the staff and the program is evaluating in terms of what it needs to do next.
It definitely is a serious event, and in the OWI happened on the belt line, I believe. Anybody who's been on the belt line, there's some crazy people out there. Crazy people out there. So either way, we'll be back next week. We'll talk a little bit more recruiting, and we'll start looking ahead towards fall camp and position battles that we're keeping an eye on as things get going here. We're not too far away, Jesse.
Can't wait. Thanks, Zach.
All right. There he is, Jesse Temple from The Athletic. You've been listening to The Camp.